Marcus Chen had spent 15 years recording sounds that most people would rather forget. As a forensic audio specialist for the FBI, he'd isolated death rattles from kidnapping calls, enhanced whispered confessions from surveillance footage, and reconstructed conversations from crime scenes where only fragments of speech remained. His equipment could detect and amplify sounds at frequencies below human hearing, could pull voices from background noise that seemed impossible to separate. But nothing in his technical arsenal prepared him for the assignment that arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. A case file marked Priority Maximum, containing GPS coordinates, a single photograph of an empty forest clearing, and a note that simply read, "Record everything, trust nothing." The case originated from a missing persons report filed 6 months earlier. Dr. Sarah Hoffman, an ethnomusicologist from Duke University, had vanished while researching what she called acoustic dead zones, areas where sound behaved in ways that defied conventional physics. Her last known location was somewhere in the Blue Ridge Mountains, in a region where her specialized recording equipment had supposedly detected impossible silence. Marcus arrived at the coordinates on a Thursday afternoon, his truck loaded with portable recording equipment, spectrum analyzers, and enough battery power to run his gear for a week. The forest seemed normal enough at first, birds calling in the canopy, wind rustling through leaves, his boots crunching on the autumn ground cover. But as he hiked deeper into the mountains, following Dr. Hoffman's GPS trail, he began to notice anomalies. His directional microphones, sensitive enough to pick up whispered conversations from 50 yards away, started registering strange patterns. The forest sounds weren't just diminishing, they were being systematically filtered. High frequencies disappeared first, then mid-tones, then bass frequencies, until only a narrow band of sound remained audible. It was as if something was selectively removing portions of the audio spectrum. When Marcus reached the clearing marked on Dr. Hoffman's map, his meters went haywire. The spectrum analyzer showed sound levels that should have been impossible, negative decibels in some frequencies, indicating not just absence of sound, but active cancellation. The clearing itself was unremarkable, a rough circle of open ground surrounded by trees, with a few weathered stones arranged in no particular pattern. But when Marcus spoke, a simple hello, to test his voice, the word seemed to fall dead the moment it left his lips. The sound didn't echo, didn't carry, didn't even seem to propagate beyond the immediate space around his mouth. It was as if the air itself was consuming his voice. Marcus set up his equipment with growing unease. As a man of science, he needed data to understand what was happening. His paranormal skepticism ran deep, forged by years of exposing audio hoaxes and explaining away ghostly voices with rational analysis of frequency patterns and environmental factors. But the readings he was getting defied every principle of acoustics he'd studied. His ultrasonic detector began picking up activity beyond the range of human hearing. The patterns were complex, structured, almost like language, but operating at frequencies that no human throat could produce. Marcus recorded hours of this ultrasonic chatter, his equipment capturing sounds that shouldn't exist in nature. As darkness fell, the acoustic anomalies intensified. His equipment registered the approach of multiple large objects moving through the forest with impossible stealth. They made no sound on the conventional spectrum, but his infrared cameras detected heat signatures, tall, angular forms that moved with predatory grace between the trees. Marcus's training kicked in. He switched to passive recording mode, letting his equipment run automatically while he remained as still and quiet as possible. Years of surveillance work had taught him the value of patience and silence. But this was different. This wasn't hiding from human subjects who might hear him breathe or shift position. This was hiding from something that seemed to hunt sound itself. Around midnight, his equipment recorded the first conventional voice. It was Dr. Hoffman, her words captured by his long-range microphones. "They're beautiful," she whispered from somewhere in the darkness. "They're trying to show me something, Marcus adjusted his directional array, triangulating the source of her voice. She was approximately 200 yards northeast of his position, but moving in patterns that made no sense. The GPS data showed her path as impossibly complex spirals that covered the same ground repeatedly, as if she was walking in carefully choreographed circles. "They speak in frequencies we can't hear," Dr. Hoffman's voice continued, clearer now as Marcus fine-tuned his equipment. "They've been trying to communicate for centuries, but our voices drown them out. They need the silence." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He'd heard this pattern before, in recordings from cult deprogramming sessions. Dr. Hoffman's voice carried the flat, affectless tone of someone under deep psychological influence. His thermal cameras suddenly registered multiple heat signatures converging on Dr. Hoffman's position. The shapes were wrong, too tall, too angular, moving with joints that bent in impossible directions. But they made no sound, even as they moved through undergrowth that should have rustled and snapped under their weight. "They're so lonely," Dr. Hoffman's voice came again. But now Marcus's equipment showed that she was speaking from multiple locations simultaneously. Either his gear was malfunctioning, or something was creating perfect acoustic reflections of her voice. "They've been alone for so long, living in the spaces between our words." Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He activated his emergency beacon, a high-frequency distress signal designed to cut through any interference and alert rescue services to his location. The beacon emitted a piercing tone at 400 Hz, well within the range of human hearing. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The forest erupted in ultrasonic screaming that overloaded his equipment and sent him reeling with his hands pressed against his ears. The heat signatures on his thermal display scattered like startled insects, moving with impossible speed through the trees. And Dr. Hoffman began screaming. Her voice, amplified by Marcus's equipment, carried across the entire valley. But it wasn't a scream of fear or pain. It was a scream of loss, of unbearable grief. She had been connected to something, part of something, and the beacon had severed that connection violently. Marcus found her 20 minutes later, curled against the base of a massive oak tree. She was alive but catatonic, her eyes staring at nothing, her hands pressed against her ears so tightly that her fingernails had drawn blood. When he touched her shoulder, she flinched away with such violence that he realized she was protecting herself from any sound his contact might make. The rescue team arrived by helicopter just before dawn, their rotors and engines creating a cacophony that sent Dr. Hoffman into convulsions. Marcus had to sedate her with the medical kit from his gear, injecting her with enough tranquilizer to keep her unconscious during the evacuation. Dr. Hoffman never recovered. She spent her remaining years in a specialized facility, completely mute, reacting with terror to any sound above a whisper. The facility's psychiatrists noted that she seemed to be listening constantly to something no one else could hear. Her head tilted at angles that suggested she was tracking movement in frequencies beyond human perception. Marcus retired 6 months after the incident, officially due to hearing damage from the ultrasonic exposure. But the real reason was simpler. He could no longer trust his own equipment. Every recording he made seemed to contain additional sounds, voices speaking in frequencies that flickered just beyond his conscious awareness. He moved to a cabin in the desert, far from any major population centers, and surrounded himself with white noise generators and acoustic dampening materials. But even there, in the artificial silence he'd created, Marcus could sometimes hear them, the lonely ones, calling to each other across vast distances in languages made of structured silence and negative space. His final recording, discovered after his death from apparent suicide, contained nothing but ambient room tone. But when the audio file was analyzed by the FBI's technical team using Marcus's own specialized equipment, they found layer upon layer of ultrasonic communication embedded in the seemingly empty space. The voices spoke of isolation, of living between words, of waiting patiently for the world to grow quiet enough that they could finally come home. They spoke of a woman who had almost learned their language, who had almost bridged the gap between their world and ours, before the harsh sounds of human technology had torn her away. And they spoke of a man who had helped them, who had shown them how to hide their voices in the gaps between frequencies, in the spaces where human ears couldn't follow. The FBI sealed Marcus's recordings and classified the case. But sometimes, late at night in the facility where they store unexplained evidence, security guards report hearing something like whispered conversations coming from the room where Marcus's files are kept. The conversations are always too quiet to make out, always just beyond the threshold of understanding, and sometimes, when the guards lean in to listen more closely, they realize that the whispers aren't coming from the recordings at all. They're coming from the spaces between the sounds, from the silence itself, speaking in frequencies that their ears almost, but not quite, can detect. Dr. Elena Vasquez had mapped territories in the Amazon where indigenous tribes feared to tread, charted islands in the Pacific where ships disappeared, and documented ghost towns across the American Southwest. But nothing in her 20-year career as a cartographer had prepared her for Whispering Hollow, a village that appeared on no modern map, yet stood as real as the morning mist that clung to its ancient rooftops. The assignment came through unusual channels. A letter arrived at her university office, written on parchment that felt centuries old, sealed with black wax bearing a symbol she didn't recognize. 3 intersecting circles with strange markings between them. The sender identified himself only as a concerned scholar and requested her expertise in documenting a settlement that exists in the spaces between conventional geography. Elena's rational mind should have dismissed it as an elaborate prank, but the coordinates provided led to a region in the Appalachian Mountains that cartographic surveys consistently marked as uninhabited wilderness. More intriguingly, satellite imagery of the area showed nothing but dense forest, yet topographical data suggested the presence of structures and cleared land. The contradiction was irresistible to her professional curiosity. She arrived at the general vicinity on a crisp October morning, her GPS unit becoming increasingly erratic as she hiked deeper into the mountains. The forest seemed wrong somehow, too quiet, too still. Even her footsteps on the fallen leaves seemed muffled, as if the very air absorbed sound. When she finally crested a ridge and looked down into the valley below, she understood why no satellite had ever captured this place. Whispering Hollow existed in a perpetual shroud of mist that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The village was clearly ancient, with buildings that predated any European settlement in the region. Stone structures with impossible angles stood alongside wooden houses that defied architectural logic. Gardens grew in perfect geometric patterns between dwellings, tended by figures who moved with deliberate, almost ritualistic precision. But it was the silence that struck her most profoundly. Even from her elevated position, she should have heard something. Voices, tools, animals, the general hum of human habitation. Instead, there was a void so complete it made her ears ring. Elena descended into the valley, her scientific training overriding the primitive fear that gnawed at her stomach. She needed to document this place, to understand how an entire village could exist undetected in the modern world. As she approached the outskirts of Whispering Hollow, she noticed the first of many stone markers, weather-worn monoliths covered in the same 3-circle symbol from the letter. The markers formed a perimeter around the village, and Elena realized they were covered in additional symbols, spirals, intersecting lines, and characters that resembled no written language she'd encountered. She photographed each marker meticulously, her camera's shutter providing the only sound in the oppressive quiet. The moment she crossed the line of markers, the silence became absolute. It wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was as if sound itself ceased to exist within the village boundaries. Elena opened her mouth to speak, to test her voice, but no words emerged. Panic seized her throat as she realized she couldn't even hear her own heartbeat, though she could feel it hammering against her ribs. The villagers noticed her immediately. They emerged from their homes and gathered in the central square, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes reflecting a terror so profound it seemed to have carved permanent lines into their features. They gestured frantically, pointing to their throats, to their ears, then to the sky with expressions of desperate warning. An elderly woman approached Eleanor, her movements deliberate and careful. She pressed a piece of bark into Eleanor's hands. It was covered in symbols identical to those on the markers, arranged in what appeared to be instructional sequences. The woman pointed to her own throat, then to the symbols, then made a cutting gesture across her neck. Eleanor studied the bark carefully. The symbols seemed to tell a story. The 3 circles appeared repeatedly, sometimes overlapping, sometimes separated by other markings. There were figures that might represent people, and others that looked distinctly non-human, tall, angular shapes with too many limbs. One sequence showed people speaking, mouths open, lines emanating outward, followed by the angular figures descending, and finally, silence, mouths closed, no lines. Understanding dawned with the weight of a gravestone settling into earth. This wasn't just a village where people couldn't speak. It was a place where sound itself had been forbidden, where the very act of making noise would summon something terrible. Eleanor spent 3 days in Whispering Hollow, communicating entirely through gestures and drawings. The villagers showed her their history, etched into the walls of their oldest building, a structure that seemed to predate human civilization. The story told in stone was one of ancient beings who dwelt in the spaces between sounds, entities that fed on vibration and voice. The first settlers had awakened them through some careless noise, and the creatures had descended to claim their due. The village's founder, a man whose name was represented by symbols Elena couldn't decipher, had made a bargain with these entities. In exchange for their withdrawal, the village would observe eternal silence. Children would be born into soundlessness, raised through touch and gesture, their voices never to disturb the fragile peace. But the curse went deeper than simple silence. Elena discovered that anyone who broke the quiet wouldn't just summon the creatures, they would become beacons, drawing the entities not just to themselves, but to anyone they'd ever spoken to in the outside world. The silence protected not just the village, but the entire world beyond its borders. On her final night, Elena was awakened by a child's movement near her makeshift shelter. The boy, perhaps 8 years old, had approached silently in the darkness. His eyes held a depth of sorrow that no child should ever know. He pressed something into her hand, a small stone carved with symbols she now recognized as warnings. The boy gestured toward the village perimeter, toward the world beyond the markers. His meaning was clear. She could leave, but she must carry the burden of knowledge. She must ensure that no one else would come seeking the village, that no one would be tempted to break the ancient silence. Elena left Whispering Hollow before dawn, climbing back over the ridge as the mist began to thin. When she turned for one last look at the village, it had already begun to fade, becoming indistinct in the growing daylight. Her photographs, she discovered later, showed only empty forest. Her GPS data indicated she had spent 3 days hiking in circles, but the stone the boy had given her remained solid and real in her pocket, its symbols a constant reminder of what she had witnessed. Elena never published her findings, never spoke of Whispering Hollow to another soul. Instead, she spent her remaining years creating false maps, leading other researchers away from the coordinates, ensuring that the ancient bargain would remain unbroken. When Elena died 5 years later, she was found at her desk, working on one final map. This one was different. It showed Whispering Hollow in perfect detail, but with a crucial addition. Around the village's perimeter, she had drawn a new set of symbols. ones that incorporated both the ancient warnings and modern cartographic notation. It was a map designed never to be read, a guide to nowhere that would ensure the nowhere remained hidden. The map was buried with her, along with the stone from the silent boy and her final notes. But sometimes, on still autumn mornings in the Appalachian Mountains, hikers report finding weathered stone markers covered in symbols they don't recognize. They photograph them, post them online, and wonder at their meaning. They never notice that after encountering the markers, their own voices begin to sound different, flatter, more muffled. They never realize that they're being watched by tall, angular shapes that slip between the trees just beyond the edges of their vision. And they never understand that their voices are becoming beacons, calling out across impossible distances to entities that have been waiting patiently for someone, anyone, to break the ancient silence and bring them home.